Hello, everyone, and welcome into crushthestreet.com. Stock markets are down big. On the day we do this interview, 3/9/2020, out the gate, we are seeing equities halted. Circuit breakers triggered. The 7% threshold for stocks were hit within minutes. 9:33 Eastern, 3 minutes into the open, we saw circuit breakers triggered and stocks halted for 15 minutes to create some sort of stability in the markets. I think it's up in the air whether or not that really does the trick. We had the markets in theory halted over the weekend and they opened up big. So stopping it for 15 minutes and then reopening it, does that really help? I don't know. But we're going to be discussing this today, the economy, the coronavirus, with our next guest, Alex Newman. He's an award-winning international journalist with a global reputation for hard-hitting reporting and the founder of Liberty Sentinel. And also with the new American.com. He's a well-rounded speaker going to different conferences, and he's going to give us a real pulse for what is going on. I'd like to make everyone aware of a brand new report that we have at Crush the Street, live updates, very up-to-date information, and ways to thrive and be positioned during this coronavirus outbreak at crushthestreet.com/virus. Crushthestreet.com/virus is where you can get that report. But without any further ado, Alex Newman, thanks for coming on Crush the Street with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kenneth. It's great to be with you again.
Well, if you would, give us some of your initial thoughts on what we're seeing in the markets right now, the coronavirus, and what do you make of it? And I'll ask you some follow-ups from there, but just some of your initial thoughts.
Yeah, we've covered this pretty extensively over at the New American Magazine too. I think the first things that really jump out to me is how dishonest and unreliable governments are. I don't trust their numbers on unemployment. I don't trust their numbers on inflation, and I don't trust their numbers on coronavirus. And I think anybody who thinks that the government is a credible source of information has just not been paying attention, or they're deliberately deceiving themselves. My second big takeaway from this is what perfect timing to provide a good cover story for the collapse of the markets. I've been saying for a long time now, I thought not just the stock market, it seems like, and I'm borrowing this term here, but we're in kind of an everything bubble where the Federal Reserve never actually dealt with the issues that caused the 2007, 2008 crisis. All they did was just flood the markets with a bunch of cheap money, as if that were actually going to solve the problem. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem. It barely even kicks the can down the road. But it does seem like the chickens may now be coming home to roost, and panic over the coronavirus would certainly be a very nice cover story. Plus, it makes the president look bad. So I wonder if there is an element of politics here. Now, that's not to downplay the significance of the virus. From what I've been reading about it, it does look like the mortality rate is higher than it would be certainly with the influenza, the regular flu. At this point, I think we need to keep things balanced and in perspective. If you have 30,000 people every year who die from the flu, we're not anywhere close to that yet with the coronavirus. But, I do understand that it can be deadly for older people. Apparently, it doesn't affect children at all. And actually, that takes me to one more interesting point. There seems to be celebrations about the coronavirus mainly striking down old people. In fact, somebody wrote in the UK Times, Ed Conway wrote a column in the London Times just a few days ago that, hey, if you were a hardline young environmentalist, this would be like the ideal situation. It's killing off all the old people who don't believe in man-made global warming, and it's going to shut down the economy for a while and reduce CO2 emissions. So strange reaction to have, what a ghoulish reaction. And so color me suspicious, Kenneth.
I definitely want to touch on that a little more, but before we do, I want to hit on the markets. Interestingly, the 10-year Treasury is now at 0.4%. I mean, it's moving. I mean, they're down another 20% overnight over the weekend. Ultra low. I mean, crazy low when you look at where we've been. And one thing, as a side note for people, if you got a mortgage and you're paying higher interest rates now might not be a bad time to look at refinancing it. Hey, you owe that money regardless, so why not? Give yourself a break and make it cheaper on yourself. So I'll just throw that out there for everyone. But my goodness, and of course you can wait until JP Morgan potentially pays you. But I don't know. I mean, that's starting to get really crazy, in the world we live in with negative interest rates. Alex, I got to ask you, based on interest rates, loose monetary policy, what do you make of this Ponzi scheme that, seemingly needs more capital to maintain status quo?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to summarize the situation we're in now, right? If they quit printing money, or quantitative easing, and all these little terms they use to conceal what they're doing, the economy collapses. And yet, if they continue printing money, I think long term, at least, probably even shorter term, we're going to see some extremely serious problems. You mentioned the Treasury yields, right? It's a perfect example of the insanity. Basically, you're lending Uncle Sam money for the privilege of losing money, right? I mean, it's guaranteed. If you lend the U.S. Treasury that money at that rate, you're going to lose money, right? They'll tell you the inflation rate is higher than the rate that they're going to be paying you for borrowing your money. So this is an absurd situation, Kenneth. It's absolutely absurd. It makes no sense. The one thing that I think is encouraging to me is that we know President Trump understands this, because he talked about it on the 2016 campaign. He said the Federal Reserve was juicing the markets and manipulating the economy and trying to pump up the stock market to make President Obama look good with these outlandishly low interest rates. He's also recently nominated somebody, I'm sure you've seen this, Kenneth, Judy Shelton, to the Federal Reserve Board. In fact, there's talk in Washington, D.C., kind of quiet talk, that she might be a good Federal Reserve Board chair. And this is a lady who has openly slammed the idea of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates. I mean, she actually compared it to resurrecting the old Soviet Central Planning Committee. So very, very smart lady in that respect. She's called for a return to a gold-backed currency. She's called for letting markets determine interest rates. And that's really where we need to go over the long term. It's absolutely insane. If somebody said we should have centrally planned grocery stores or centrally planned oil markets, everybody would recognize that was idiotic in the extreme. We've had, 120 years of experiments in communism, socialism, and they always fail. Why would we think it would work any better in establishing interest rates, right? It just makes no sense at all. And Judy Shelton understands this, and President Trump understands this. So I think that's very encouraging. But, on the flip side, we're still in this mess, right? We're still in this mess where we have massive amounts of money being created and pumped into the system at insanely low interest rates that are not justified by fundamentals. And it's almost like, the drug addict example, right? We're just going to keep pumping the patient full of heroin, hoping that suddenly he gets cured. That's not going to happen. Eventually, you're going to kill the patient if you continue this. And so we need to be honest. We need to recognize that. It's not Donald Trump's fault. Of course, the Democrats and the establishment media will try to blame Donald Trump. And we said this right after he was elected. This is the system. The system is the problem. And any sustainable solution to this problem is going to have to involve systemic change, getting rid of the free, easy money, getting rid of the centrally planned interest rates, and ultimately getting rid of the entire Ponzi scheme that is the Federal Reserve System.
Alex, what are your thoughts? I know you cover politics quite a bit. What are your thoughts on Donald Trump, his electability in the 2020 election, having to deal with this contagion, this financial market collapse, if you want to call it that? And I guess that has to do with how bad do you expect this to get? And is it going to carry over until November?
Yeah, and I think that's the $500 million question, or $500 trillion question. I said shortly after President Trump was elected on a very anti-establishment platform, exposing the Federal Reserve, exposing globalism, promising to stop socialism, talking about the indoctrination of our children in government schools. I said, whoa, this guy is not what we normally see in the controlled world of American politics. This is something different. And so we sounded the alarm right away, right? 2016, we started sounding the alarm about the possibility that the economy would be put through an implosion and a controlled demolition, so to speak, before the upcoming election. And I still think that's a real prospect, especially when you look at the Democratic field. You realize these people are in big trouble, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have Joe Biden, who, not meaning to sound, funny or anything like that, very clearly is showing signs of mental deterioration. And we've all seen old people, as they start going through that. It's a very sad thing. He may, if he were to be elected, which at this point sounds preposterous, he would, likely be removed under the 25th Amendment. The guy can't remember what city he's in. He can't remember who he's running. He can't even remember what office he's running for anymore. Right? The other day, he said he was running for the Senate. The guy is clearly losing his mind. And then on the other hand, you have Bernie Sanders, a socialist. And that's a real risk too. What if we were to have an economic collapse and the media and Bernie Sanders were to join forces and say, hey, look, this is all because of Donald Trump. This is all because he was, trying to rearrange the trading system that has been ripping off America for so long. It's all because he was calling out the Federal Reserve and their manipulation of the economy. We could end up with a serious problem. So, I'm not the only one who's been making these warnings, but I think it's not outside the realm of possibility that we could see, a very serious economic crisis, potentially even along the lines of the Great Depression, collapse in stock prices, collapse in real estate prices, obviously continued manipulation of gold and silver prices leading into the 2020 election, which would set the stage for some very, very interesting things.
So, Alex, why has the coronavirus become so politicized? It seems like Republicans are playing it cool, and the Democrats are seemingly more concerned about it and spreading a little bit more fear. And we see this. Why do people fall in line with this? If whether it's abortion or gay rights, labor union support, global warming, taxing the rich, God, all these things are largely uncorrelated. But when it comes to polarization and where people fall in line, it kind of seems like mass groups of people fall in line with the political party's general sentiment or view of something. And I'm seeing that right now with Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it is political. And I think it's clear the political establishment in the United States, not just the Democrat establishment, the political establishment loathes Donald Trump. They hate him with a passion. And that's not because he hasn't given them any gifts. From time to time, he'll do something that furthers the agenda of the political elites that they've been pursuing for generations now. But they can't control him, and he calls them out. And so, the hatred that we see on the Democratic side, they have the media backing them up. And so this kind of trickles down to the Democratic Party base. I think we're starting to see the same thing among the Republican establishment. They can't be quite as open about it. People like Mitt Romney have kind of tested the waters, sticking their toe in, see how far they can go before they get removed from office and completely discredited politically and ruin their own political careers. I think if they thought they could get away with it, many, many more establishment-minded Republicans would be joining the bandwagon. And so I think it's the same with this response to the coronavirus. Democrats sense an opportunity. Hey, we can make this a political issue. We can try to make the president look bad. The American people, when they get worried about things like viruses and, whatever it is, economic collapse, they look to the president not only for solutions, but also as a source of responsibility. It really was never supposed to be that way. The president is not the dictator of this country. He's not the overlord. He doesn't control viruses, and he shouldn't control money, and he shouldn't control the economy. But, generations of Americans have been raised by government schools, by fake media, to look at the office of the presidency as kind of like, the father of the nation who's going to take care of us and read us bedtime stories and keep us safe from all the boogeymen. And that's become very problematic, but it's become very helpful to the Democrats because now they think they can politicize this. They can try to make the president look bad. They can harm his reelection prospects. They can hurt Republicans all down the line. And that's a very dangerous situation when we start looking at human tragedies, natural disasters, epidemics, pandemics, as something to blame on a political leader. But that's where we're moving, unfortunately. And, it seems like everything is getting politicized, Kenneth. I'm sure you see it as well. There's like nothing nowadays. I mean, you go to family dinners, everything has become politicized. It's very unfortunate. I think it's very dangerous. And I hope we can reverse course.
Alex, give us some perspective, if you would, based on your research. 105,000 cases of coronavirus, and this number just keeps going up by the thousands, seem every day. And one of the things that you mentioned, which I would agree with you, is the government numbers are not necessarily to be trusted. One thing I would ask is, can we trust the death count? At this point, we know that 434 people died. And I almost don't trust the government numbers from the optimistic perspective. Like, there's probably a lot more people that have the coronavirus. But if the death count is right, then the mortality rate is even lower. So is there any truth to that? Or would you be more concerned about it being more lethal than the government is leading us on to believe?
You know, I think part of this analysis has to be looking at the motivations of government. You know, again, I always say rule number one, don't trust the government. Rule number two, don't trust the media, right? Chances are good that they're lying to you. You know, when it comes to China, we know now for a fact that a lot of these cases that are being described as coronavirus, they don't actually have any verification of that. They're calling it a clinical diagnosis, where, you know, they don't have an actual kit to test whether there's a presence of the virus there. What they're doing is they're putting people through scans to look at their lungs, and if they find certain characteristics that could come from all sorts of things, not necessarily from the coronavirus, they're labeling it as a clinical diagnosis of coronavirus. So it could be under, it could be over. You know, at this point, it's really hard to know. But you know, what I would say to people is naturally, you know, you should be prepared. And I say this all the time: whether there's a coronavirus or not, you should always be prepared. Not just in terms of you know, your financial portfolio and keeping your assets safe, but also from a personal perspective. You know, if you don't have a little bit of extra food, a little bit of extra water, a little bit of extra fuel at your house, why not? Right? I mean, it's just common sense. And again, I would take anything the government says with an enormous dose of skepticism. They've got a long track record of being dishonest, of pushing the agenda that suits them. Now, you know, I've seen evidence that this coronavirus could be potentially very significant in terms of mortality, in terms of spreading. You know, I've seen reports that really it's being underestimated, especially in China. In fact, I am now increasingly being convinced that this virus itself probably came out of a Chinese bioweapons lab in Wuhan. And so the Chinese government would naturally have a very obvious motive to deceive people about what's going on here. There may be something going on with you know, various factions in China vying for control. But when it comes to the U.S., you know, there's a whole different set of motivations that might lead the government officials to try to be, you know, less than honest, shall we say, about what's really going on. So, you know, I would just urge people, be responsible, not only just in terms of your financial portfolio and your assets and your wealth, but also in terms of your personal safety, your health. You know, I'm not terribly concerned about it. I'm getting on a plane in just a little bit to head to Utah, but a lot of my international engagements have been canceled. I had a trip coming up in just a few weeks to Africa and Europe. Now, because of different lockdowns in different European countries and African countries, that trip looks like it may not happen. But, you know, just be prudent. So.
Alex, what is your instinct and based on what you're reading tell you about the coronavirus and it potentially getting weaker as it seeks to live? You know, this concept of if it's killing the hosts, then it's not surviving, right? And the idea is that it mutates so it can be around. And that's why the flu virus weakens over time. And, you know, many, many years ago, the flu virus was much more lethal, and now it's mutated over time, and it's not as lethal because it's evolved a bit. And is there any optimism for you that the coronavirus is weakening, and do you expect it to drop off as weather warms up going into the spring and summer?
Yeah, I think at some point, you know, it will start to slow down and dissipate. You know, I've heard reports coming out of China that may already be happening there. They may have already turned the corner there. Whether those reports are credible or not, I don't know. You know, when I say don't trust the government, that applies 1,000 times more to a mass murdering communist dictatorship than it does to, you know, a government in the Western world. But, you know, I think at some point it is going to slow down. At some point it is going to dissipate, and, you know, it'll be, you know, fine again for people to quit worrying. When that moment will come, I don't know. You know, I've seen people whose opinions I trust highly on these issues, people who do have a background in medicine and healthcare, things like that, who've said that they expect some pretty serious effects in the United States. Now, you know, I think we talked a little bit before the show on the bright side. It does seem to be largely sparing children. Right, you know, the death rate when it comes to even the infection rate when it comes to children is very, very small relative to the adult population, and the mortality rate is even lower. So, you know, I think that's very good. But when it comes to infecting older people, I think this may be around for a while. I think the consequences may be pretty significant if it's not brought under control. But, you know, at this point, I think with so much confusion It'll take time for the dust to settle and for us to get a better understanding of what's going on. Again, we have been covering this pretty extensively at the New American. We just have an article up today about kind of the media-driven panic around it. A lot of stores across the country now, they're all sold out and stuff. You have people, fighting each other to get hand sanitizer and stuff. I think a lot of that is media-driven panic. I don't think that's warranted. Even if we were dealing with a crisis, this is really silly behavior. This is not how Americans ought to be behaving, or human beings ought to be behaving for that matter. But I think we do need to guard against media-driven panic, especially if it's being politically weaponized to try to damage the president or a particular party. But as for where this goes from here, eventually I think it will die out, but it may take time. So,
Alex, I appreciate your time and coming on Crush the Street with me today. If people want to learn more about you, your websites, and your work, maybe see you at one of your events if it doesn't get canceled, please let them know where they can go and what they can expect to find.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Kenneth, for having me on the program. It's always a pleasure. You do really great work, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on. Most of my articles appear at the New American, either in the print magazine or online at thenewamerican.com. I'm going to Utah, as I said, later today. I've got a mini speaking tour there, so I'll be in Salt Lake City, St. George. If people want to show up to those, I've got 4 or 5 speeches there. After that, I'll be, like I said, going to Europe, Africa, if those don't all get canceled, and then a mini tour of the Midwest coming up, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, a few states up there. That'll be in late April. We've got a big event down in Florida, April 17th and 18th, called Rescuing Our Children. Would love to see people there. You can always get in touch with me. My email's a.newman@thenewamerican.com. And I'm all over social media. So thank you once again, Kenneth, for having me. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for keeping people informed on these important issues. And to the viewers, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alex. We will be in contact very soon. I hope to have you on once again to follow up on obviously the unfolding events and to cover the election too. I mean, we didn't even talk too much about that, but I think this year is going to be a very dynamic, explosive year on the political front. So thank you so much.
Thank you again, Kenneth.